A warm welcome to all of our guests. My name is Cindy Surinya Bishop, and it is my great honor to host today's event presented by the United Nations in Asia and the Pacific. Today we launch the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, and we showcase actions honoring the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. 2020 has been a year of lessons. As the world retreated indoors due to lockdown measures to curb the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw an alarming increase in the already existing pandemic of violence against women. The burden of violence against women has long kept women focused on basic safety and survival rather than contributing, thriving, and innovating. Rising violence against women also threatens the already fragile progress being made in strengthening gender equalities and creating safer, more equal societies. This, in turn, impacts the fight against poverty and worsens the inequality in countless other areas. The United Nations Secretary General has called for urgent and accelerated global action to end violence against women in the era of COVID-19 by a growing set of leaders and influencers beyond government and civil society to the private sector, media and entertainment, faith leaders, young people, and many more. This year, the Secretary General's Unite campaign takes on the theme, Orange the World, Fund, Respond, Prevent, Collect, bringing attention to the need to end violence against women upfront in national COVID-19 response and recovery efforts. Today's event is a regional dialogue to hear from thought leaders, civil society leaders, and decision makers on the issues that keep ending violence against women one of the toughest issues today, as it holds back women, children, families, societies, and whole economies. The pandemic may have separated us physically, but in some ways we are connected all the more through technology, as it allows speakers from across this wide region and our audience to join us for today's event. I would like to open the dialogue by inviting Ms. Armida Salcia Alisjabana, the United Nations Undersecretary General and the Executive Secretary to the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, to lay out the current issues about gender-based violence in the era of COVID-19 from the context of Asia and the Pacific. Madam, we are honored to have you with us this morning. As we start, I would like to ask you, why is gender-based violence getting so much attention in the context of COVID-19? What is the connection between gender-based violence and economic impacts of COVID-19? And why has the UN Secretary General made repeated calls for accelerated and concrete actions to address gender-based violence right now?
Well, before COVID-19 pandemic, in more normal times, gender-based violence or violence against women and girls is already a big challenge in our region. Many countries face these challenges, from countries in the Pacific, countries in South Asia, countries in our part of the sub-region, Southeast Asia. About, let's say, according to the data statistics, about 30-40% of women suffered some form of this gender-based violence, such as abuse by their intimate partners. So then COVID-19, this pandemic, with this quarantine, lockdown, social distancing, social isolation. So this has exacerbated the key risk factors for this violence against women and girls. So women are definitely has been impacted the most. So we've seen escalation of violence against women in many countries, particularly domestic violence. Again, why this is so? Because this is also directly connected with this impact, socio-economic impact of COVID-19. We see that economy has slowed down or even contracted in almost all cases. Rising unemployment, economic insecurity or job insecurity, a lot of job loss, and then also a risk of food insecurity, a risk of hunger in many parts of the region, and then school closure, massive migration flows, yeah, going back to their country, yeah, a country of origin. So this exacerbated, yeah, from the economic impact, socio-economic impact. So therefore, the multiple forms of violence, yeah, that we see has increased, physical as well as psychosocial, right, including sexual abuse, harassment, and then it's not only in person, yeah, in person, but also apparently online, because everybody now goes online, yeah, and also the cases increase and becoming more and more complex, yeah. So therefore, situation is like this, but on the other hand, victims oftentimes cannot access the needed help, yeah, because of this lockdown, and also the help, yeah, the support services capacity are not there anymore, or being curtailed, or become unavailable. Yeah, so this is like a double hit, yeah, for the women and girls. Because of this urgency, so therefore, Secretary General Antonio Guterres appealed to end the violence now, not later, but how? Yeah, to end the violence now with concrete and accelerated action. So of course, yeah, very very short term, very urgent is how to mitigate. Yeah, the first thing is how to mitigate the impact, socio-economic impact through the stimulus packages and so on. Make sure that women get priority, yeah, and to get the help needed, to be able to access, yeah, the help, whether it's health care or non-health care, as well as certain measures, yeah, through the stimulus packages. So that's very short term, and then medium long term solution, of course, is more complex. Yeah. So basically, all the ongoing initiatives. So we need to scale up, and we have to work as one, the UN system, in collaboration with all stakeholders.
Thank you so much for your help in framing violence against women in today's context. I have to agree with you that it is very complex indeed. And given these extraordinary circumstances, you've already mentioned that the UNSG is calling for the UN system to work together to address gender-based violence. What actions do you see as critical to be effective in ending violence against women and girls? And what is your commitment to ending gender-based violence?
Yeah, again, the critical areas of action I see for how to mitigate. Second, how to empower the women and also girls. Third, the need for change, yeah, accelerate change in social behavior. Fourth is how to create and accelerate the enabling environment. Yeah, so let me quickly go into the four areas of critical areas of action one by one. On the mitigation during the pandemic, I already alluded earlier, but again, to refresh, to go quickly over the mitigation action, which again needs to be built into the stimulus packages. Now, government is implementing and giving the stimulus packages in record numbers of values in record time to targeted segment of the population. To include social assistance to the vulnerable household groups, including MSMEs, the micro, small, and medium enterprises, which many of these enterprises are headed by women. So therefore, the stimulus packages, social assistance, how to reduce the enormous economic impact or economic stress. Yeah, for example, cash transfer, training for ICT capacity to migrate their business, these MSMEs, to online platform so they can survive as well as thrive. Yeah, and benefit from the economic opportunity during this crisis, yeah, because they can utilize the online platform to reach the consumer that will buy their goods and services. Also, to ensure the help and support to victims are available and can be accessed, whether it's health, psychosocial support, helpline, shelters, etc. Yeah, so these are very important. Second, how to empower the women and girls themselves. So therefore, we need to scale up the program, the various very good program and projects. Yeah, on, for example, on economic empowerment, training of women entrepreneurs, the education of women, including literacy, digital literacy. Yeah, so how to access the ICT infrastructure, this various, how to use the apps, how to access internet, and digital skills. But of course, government needs, yeah, to support also with the accessibility, this internet connection and so on. Also, including very important the ICT skills for women, including knowledge of privacy and digital security. Yeah, because we understand that one, yeah, of the negative impact of this COVID-19 lockdown is the increase, yeah, this online also harassment. And the more longer term is, of course, education of women and girls is very high priority. The third one is change in social behavior, which very important, yeah, to have this, to be able to stop the violence against women and girls now through social media campaign, to work closely with CSO, as well as early education, yeah, for the youth, and not only the youth, yeah, from the early years, the need to understand, yeah, that women and girls, yeah, have equal place in the society, yeah. So needs to be from the early years. And also the very important role of community leaders and religious leaders, certainly in certain parts of the region, countries, especially in the rural areas. Fourth, to create the enabling environment, national, local legislation, how to prohibit violence against women and girls. Yeah, provide the support, awareness raising program for women empowerment, as well as the dedicated resources to go with that. Yeah. So for all these four elements, we, UN family, will work together, already work together, as well as work closely with stakeholders, women groups, women associations, CSO. On ESCAP commitment, I can say too, in the sense we certainly support the enabling, to create the enabling environment, as we as a regional commission, we can convene member states, which is government. For example, in the review and the follow-up action to Beijing Plus 25, yeah, last November, last year, yeah, we convened member states of our region, 53 member states, 9 associate members, as well as stakeholders, how to translate, yeah, the follow-up review, how first have to have the commitment at the regional level, and then with that commitment, government member state can translate into national commitment and further make it concrete, yeah, through program action plan. Second, a more specific program project, which is we are undertaking right now on catalyzing women entrepreneurship using ICT platform, fintech. Yeah, so we train, we work with over 20,000 women entrepreneurs in 6 countries, which is 2 countries to South Asia, 2 in Southeast Asia, 2 in the Pacific. Countries which are least developed countries, countries which are landlocked developing countries, countries which are also small island developing states. Yeah, the 6, yeah, are represented, these cluster of countries. So 2 major elements of that project, very concrete, work with the government to make the enabling policy environment, so national as well as national legislation, to empower these women entrepreneurs, and the training of the women entrepreneurs, how to utilize and benefit from ICT platform fintech with seeds funding. We hope that we can scale up this initiative as well as the various stakeholders, government, or companies later on will take up this initiative further and scale up wider. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam, for your leadership and commitments. It will take a concerted effort from all stakeholders and partners, but I do believe that if we work together, it will happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.
To help further understand this issue from the context of Southeast Asia, we will now hear from His Excellency Mr. Kung Fook, Deputy Secretary General, ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community, to help understand the importance of ending violence against women and also to reflect on the regional and national commitments to accelerate progress.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning. Reaffirming ASEAN commitment to advance gender equalities and to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Beijing Declarations and Platform for Action, ASEAN has actively addressed gender impacts of the pandemic while acknowledging that women are at the forefront of COVID-19 responses and hold the key to recovery process. On the occasion of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence for the year 2020, I would like to urge all of us to continue to tackle violence against women and girls, as its incidence is on the rapid rise during the pandemic. In so doing, essential services are needed, access to quality healthcare is mandatory, and gender statistics are imperative for us to overcome challenges and emerge as ever more resilient, inclusive, and gender-responsive communities. Moving forward with ASEAN Comprehensive and Sustainable Recovery, ASEAN is determined to place women leadership and empowerment at the heart of recovery through the implementation of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and its implementation plan. We believe that women are the solution and that efforts must be redoubled to ensure that our progresses to advance gender equalities and women's empowerment will not be reversed by the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for sharing your insights and for your leadership in ASEAN and beyond on this issue. It is clear that ASEAN has enormous potential to sustain progress on ending violence against women, since it is a social, economic, and security issue that affects everyone. Before we bring on our next panelists, let's begin with a musical performance from a very talented young violinist, June Chanakan Wisukcho. She inspired many with her performance on Thailand's Got Talent with her well-known composition, Unforgettable Desire. We will next have a listening session with activists, civil society representatives, and researchers from across the region who will come to share their incredible journeys to counter gender-based violence despite the disruptions caused by COVID-19. I want to highlight here that some of the information and stories that you will hear could be unsettling, so please practice self-care. We have asked each of our experts to focus on one area of the campaign call to action this year, and that is fund, respond, prevent, and collect. The 4 speakers in this session are Dr. Aparna Joshi, founder and project director, ICOL, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, India. Dr. Emma Fulu, founder and director, the Equality Institute, Australia. Ms. Kawar Mumtaz, former chairperson, National Commission on Status of Women, Pakistan. And Ms. Jalen Paclaren, Executive Director of the Women's Legal and Human Rights Bureau, Philippines. And I will start with our first speaker, Dr. Aparna Joshi, to share her views on responding to gender-based violence during COVID-19. My question to you, Dr. Joshi, is, what adaptations and innovations have you seen frontline service providers make to ensure that critical and life-saving services for gender-based violence can be continued and accessed amid the pandemic? And what challenges have frontline service providers faced, and what kind of support has enabled them to continue the work?
Thank you, Cindy, for your question. And I think I would like to start by, telling a little bit about what was the picture of gender-based violence even prior to the pandemic. All of us are aware that gender-based violence was a challenge in India and many other countries even prior to the pandemic. Almost 1 in 3 or 1 in 5 women were facing gender-based violence in their intimate relationships in their households. And the pandemic affected women in a very, very adverse manner. For example, if you look at the figures from National Commission for Women in India, it was registered that gender-based violence increased by at least 2.5 times in a country like India during a national lockdown. So obviously we were battling with many, many issues, but the pandemic made it very, very difficult with its health, economic, social impact. With women being locked down within their households, not having support, not having access to formal services or to their everyday safety mechanisms. Even health services, which were already burdened with a lot of work, got further burdened with COVID-related duties, and therefore women had very little access to safety mechanisms or support mechanisms. Now the frontline workers therefore had to make a lot of modifications because they were facing a lot of challenges. I think one of the first challenges I would talk about is to deal with the travel restrictions or the mobility restrictions, because they couldn't access women at the ground level. They definitely couldn't, immediately transition into technology-assisted services. So there was a bit of a delay in terms of women's need for accessing services, women's experiences of violence within their households, and the response that they got. So definitely, I think one of the first tasks that frontline workers had to do is to map what is this new nature or existing, exacerbations of the existing forms of violence that women were facing. And they also had to map what were the services available at the ground level. So that transition, as well as transitioning into telephone-based counseling services or technology-assisted counseling services, took some time for the frontline workers. But I can see a lot of definite innovations over there that many frontline workers or organizations across different countries, including India, created directory of services and created technological services which were accessible to women, which means women had to be informed about the existence of these services. So there were a lot of creative strategies which were used in terms of, having local shops or medical shops, displaying numbers of these telephone service access also. Another challenge that frontline workers had to face is a lot of times there is access to technology in the household, but women necessarily may not have access to technology because it's often gendered, monitored, So they had to make sure that women could access these telephone-based or technology-based services, but in a very, very safe manner. So which means, they had to come up with very, very creative strategies, such as maybe creating some sort of a safety word or a code word as women access those services while being surveilled or monitored within their households also. So a lot of, frontline workers had to work within the constraints of this monitoring, within the constraints of women calling from the household and perhaps not having the privacy or safety to respond also. Frontline workers also had to create a lot of innovations as to how do women keep themselves safe within the limited access to support systems, within the constraints of the home, and what kind of strategies do they create to negotiate power within those households also. So while the frontline workers couldn't travel to the ground level, frontline workers again created many, many innovations to activate ground level services which were accessible within a limited periphery for women. For example, many countries like India or Philippines or Mongolia created, activated local governance structures or self-help groups for women, and thereby, at least whenever there were extreme cases, somebody could reach to women's houses. Or if women had to exit during those mobility restrictions or lockdowns also, there were creative strategies in terms of creating shelters, maybe in health facilities or tie up with Airbnbs. So there were several such innovations also that had to be created. I think tie up with police structures, so whatever was available at the ground level was another innovation to deal with this challenge. So I think creation of several linkages is something that we saw even during this, sort of a challenging time. Another challenge that many of the workers face, that large kind of service delivery or response that happens is face-to-face. So even to transition to this technology-assisted counseling or psychosocial support or legal support modality meant that capacities of the frontline workers or counselors or those who were dealing with women had to be built. So you could see several such initiatives actually coming up, whereby now capacity enhancement initiatives were carried out using technology. And that was a great vision because, for example, the helpline that I run and the organization that I run, we conducted these capacity enhancement initiatives for counselors across several states, something which is not likely to happen perhaps during crisis on pandemic time. So we could cut across geographical boundaries, and frontline workers across several regions could come together, exchange their worries, exchange their innovations, and draw strength from each other. So capacity enhancement was another area where we could find definitely, some challenges, at the same time some innovations also through the use of technology. And one of the last areas that I would like to talk about in terms of challenge as well as innovations, because all of this work, be it legal work or safety work with women, or women were losing livelihood, there was a lot of impact on women, not only because they were being impacted, but because their partners were being impacted because of loss of livelihood. There was ban on substances in many countries, which means the withdrawal symptoms were also, were used as excuses to displace anger and violence on women. So while frontline workers were dealing with all of these narratives of violence and trauma, it is very important to remember that frontline workers were part of the same community, the same pandemic, and the pandemic was also actually hitting or impacting the frontline workers in a similar manner sometimes. There were parallel trajectories of women's lives as well as frontline workers' lives. And while they were providing care, they had to be cared for also. Many a times frontline workers or health workers or counselors talked about facing stigma while they actually, were providing services. They faced attacks, or they were facing similar kinds of violence or violations in their own homes as they provided care for women. So I could see that a lot of innovations, including, ICOL, created many opportunities for frontline workers to care for themselves, because burnout or vicarious trauma is a big phenomenon, and unless you take care of frontline workers, there is no service delivery, there is no response. So a lot of innovations around how do you care for the carers also, and I call using again technology to ensure that the necessary support is provided. So I would like to wrap my response by saying that while COVID pandemic has created several challenges for all of us, and frontline workers had to adapt to these challenges and create new modalities of responses, it has opened up newer possibilities also. And we have seen great resilience from women as well as frontline workers. The possibilities afforded by technology, creative shelters, the safety apps, or the intersectoral linkages, or the accessing of ground level services in terms of governance or self-help groups. I hope some of these possibilities continue during the pandemic as well as beyond the pandemic, so to respond effectively to the issue of gender-based violence.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi, for highlighting these points and also areas that need greater attention as well. It's clear that in moments of crisis such as domestic violence or the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, support still is so much needed, and new solutions as well in terms of providing life-saving help to women all over the world. Thank you so much. We will now move on to the next call to action, and that is the area of prevention. I will now like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Emma Fulu, to share her insights on the following question. Dr. Emma, what lessons and reminders have you witnessed about maintaining focus on preventing violence against women and girls, even during emergencies such as the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, thank you, Cindy, and good evening, everybody. I think as already has been mentioned, we've seen that the COVID pandemic certainly has put women and children at greater risk of violence, and that's been discussed, and I think we heard a lot about the great innovation that's happening in that area. So we obviously need to continue that work to respond to the needs of women and children. But we also need to think about how do we stop violence happening in the first place? You see, I think when we're in crisis, when systems break down and so much in our lives has fundamentally changed, we also have this opportunity to reimagine our future, to think about how we create a better, more equitable and safer world. And so I think COVID-19 actually offers this unprecedented opportunity to really create long-term transformative change. So I think I've sort of been reflecting on a few areas where I've seen that. And first, I would say COVID has led to a sort of reimagining of development programming. I think we see the need now for flexibility in funding and programs that can better, I guess, deal with unexpected shocks. And I think it's shown us that governments and service providers, civil society organizations, businesses, media, all need to work together and all have a role to play to co-create these kind of innovative responses to violence against women. So I think this is a real opportunity to create innovative policy and program responses that can set up prevention measures that are going to last sort of much longer than the COVID-19 pandemic and really beyond this emergency, and reduce violence against women in the long term. I think interestingly, perhaps the ability not to travel for many of us has, I think, provided an opportunity to really centre the expertise of local grassroots organisations and what's happening in the immediate communities around them. Secondly, I think I wanted to highlight that the pandemic has shown, I guess, or brought into focus not just gender inequality, but many other inequalities. And in fact has threatened to exacerbate them. So I think our response needs to see women not as a sort of homogenous, monolithic group, but recognise and respond to the diverse lived experiences of different women. And that obviously includes women with disabilities, migrant women, trans women, Indigenous women, and many others. And they really need to be at the table where decisions are being made, and their needs and their solutions need to be prioritised. Third, I would say I still am a little concerned that the progress we've made in eliminating violence against women or addressing violence against women in the region over the last 30 years faces potential undoing or backwards movement unless we really address it during the pandemic. I feel that harmful gender norms and roles have further been entrenched in some ways. Women are bearing the double and triple burdens of work on the front lines and in caring and in home schooling responsibilities, for example, and at the same time they're being left out of the decision-making processes in many cases. So these sort of deeply unequal power relations between men and women, which we know are the root cause of violence against women, now is time to really work, I think, across sectors towards transformation of these harmful norms and structures. And I was thinking, there's lots of opportunities with more men at home, for example. Why not see this as an opportunity to promote men's more stronger engagement in caring roles and disrupt historically gender unequal roles and responsibilities? Why not use economic recovery packages to advance women's economic empowerment or women's leadership positions? And finally, I would say that there is hope. We know that violence is preventable. We have evidence-based strategies now that demonstrate we can actually reduce rates of violence in relatively short periods of time, in program cycles, not in generations. There's a respect framework now which outlines the strategies that we know work to prevent violence against women, and these include things such as promoting gender equality through laws and policies, strengthening relationships, empowering women, ensuring access to services, reducing poverty at the community and household level, as well as making environments such as public spaces, schools and workplaces safer. Other things such as preventing childhood and adolescent abuse and transforming attitudes and norms can be also very impactful. So we have these prevention approaches that we know work. We do have to consider thoughtfully how to adapt those to the current context to ensure that no unintended harm is done and that women's safety is placed at the centre of any work. But I think there are some key approaches that we can consider in the prevention space. I'll just name a few that I've been thinking about. The first is around the use of media messaging. I think we can continue to use that to influence social norms. It's critical for the media to continue to engage in raising the visibility of violence against women and children, challenging stereotypes, and ensuring that messages are framed with a clear understanding that violence against women is never excusable. I think there's opportunities to leverage remote learning and distance education, so to have programs and lessons on healthy relationships, appropriate use of technology, life skills and comprehensive sexuality education, they can be embedded in distance learning methods. I think we can continue to use public health channels and communication with the recognition that actually many of the sort of things that have arisen because of COVID and associated factors like loss of employment and increased consumption of alcohol and substance abuse, etc., they're actually risk factors of violence against women and children as well, and we need to continue to make those linkages. I would also say there's an opportunity to provide economic and livelihood support to women and households. So this could include cash transfers, low or no interest loans, tax relief, provision of food and basic household goods, for example, and all of this can support women's economic empowerment, which we know can contribute to ending violence against women. We can also work through workplaces and engage employees and employers to communicate zero tolerance when it comes to violence, but also take positive and proactive steps around challenging gender stereotypes, challenging any discrimination or inequalities within the workplace, and encouraging respectful and safe environments. And finally, I would say that there's still opportunities to continue the community mobilisation, social movement, activist work that really has been the bedrock of prevention work around the world. I know that that is hard in the current context, and that's being adapted. But people are using incredibly innovative methods to ensure that the community engagement is still at the centre when it is safe to do so. If the restrictions are ongoing, that can include work through online media, radio, television, working with stakeholders such as faith leaders and local leaders. And we see that sort of grassroots activist work, I think, of women's organisation and feminist movements continuing to be central to the work of prevention. So I also end on a note of hope that I think that the COVID pandemic, while tragic and so challenging for many women and girls around the region, really offers us an opportunity to create long-term transformative change to end violence against women.
Thank you, Dr. Fulu, for your insights and your inspiration. I'd like to just echo your hopeful, positive message as well in terms of finding new creative ways that we can challenge gender norms. During COVID-19 here in Thailand, we wanted to diffuse some of the tensions caused by having to be at home and encourage men to take up some of the burden of the house care as well. And so we teamed up with some local influencers for a He for She at Home challenge, which was a nice way to engage both men and women and create a vision of a more equal society as well. So thank you very much. We're moving on to our next call to action, and that is collect. And our next speaker is a renowned expert on human rights in the region, Ms. Karwar Mumtaz. Ms. Mumtaz, how has data helped in strengthening services for gender-based violence during the pandemic?
Thank you very much for this session, and I would like to appreciate the speakers before me who identified the challenges and also new ways of looking at those challenges. And I will start by first of all emphasizing that we do need data to be able to make specific directed interventions. Without the information, it's very difficult to address the issues of gender-based violence. We also know that in our societies, gender-based violence pre-exists the situation. And it's fairly high level of gender-based violence. So first of all, when a pandemic or an emergency arises, you need to respond immediately, and therefore you need information immediately. And for that, I think we need to leverage existing data that there is in our systems. All of our countries, I think, in the region do have some, maybe not adequate, but enough data to start on. The other thing is that when a pandemic hits or an emergency hits, and this particular one where everybody has to be isolated and constrained and economic opportunities have been limited or reduced, and there's the economic pressure, there is the pressure of people inside the house where the women get overburdened, we see a spike, and that is we learn from the experiences of the past of emergencies that there's always a spike in the incidence of violence. So in this situation, the option is either to do a survey, which takes time, and you need to respond immediately. So you need more urgent information and data. And for that, I think we need to look at the service providers. And there are, as we've seen, at least in Pakistan, I can tell you that there had to be relief work, food, livelihoods, medications at home. So for that, all of a sudden, you saw this surge in relief workers volunteering as well as being employed. And I think they are one of the big sources of information that we get on gender-based violence. When we see, for instance, the information that we are getting, there's a whole focus on livelihood needs, but very little focus or even recognition of gender-based violence. And I think that has to come in the cognizance framework of relief providers. And these relief providers often are philanthropists or local leaders, but again, I can take the example here, and I'm sure in other areas, that local organizations, areas where there were already existing grassroots organizations, they were the most effective reaching out groups. And I think we need to build it into our system in such situations to get feedback on gender-based violence also. not only food or other requirements, but also the requirement of women who then are suffering from increased violence. So I feel that it's very important that we gear the service providers for generating that data, and for that we need to actually plan out a bit to be able to build it into their work frames and work streams, this dimension. The other thing I would like to also say that there have been evidence, at least in Pakistan, that men staying at home have realized the burden of work of women. So I think where that happens, that needs to be highlighted. As we just heard, that how do we also focus on women, on men, and how we bring them into the loop of recognizing that what kind of gender-based violence is taking place. But we're talking about data. So I think data has to be collected by that, but we should also, there is the other longer term perspective on data collection. I think we all need benchmarking, prevalence of violence against women surveys, which should be periodic, but which provides us the baseline and locations where different kinds of forms of violence are taking place. Because we know that in different places within our own countries, there is prevalence of certain kinds of violence. In many places, there's domestic violence, there is mental torture, there is physical violence, there's sexual violence. So to be able to sift some of that. So the third thing that I would like to say that we have to build on the institutions that already exist. We don't need to create new institutions. We need to have institutions who, while providing services, are also documenting. Shelters should be able to document the kind of violence that is most prominently, brought to their attention. Similarly, the police record should be there all the time. The local government should be able to respond. The local councillors, especially women and men. So I think there are sources that we need to leverage and mobilize in the times of pandemic. I'll give you the example of the earthquake in Pakistan in 2005. We had robust local government at that time, and we found that the local government representatives were the first point of call for everybody in the community, but were also the most responsive. So I think it's important to leverage those, but also at the same time, look at the long term, see this as an opportunity, as everybody has said. How do we see this as an opportunity to create systems of data collection that go beyond the pandemic, which are there, a resource to be used when we have an emergency, because we always get into a fluster because we've not built systems. And finally, I would also like to say that essential gender-based violence should be made an essential service, part of the essential service in our systems. This police is the essential service, medical facilities are essential services. Gender-based violence support service should also be seen as essential services, which keep data at the local level, but also we need rapid surveys where we feel that there is higher levels of violence. So those are things that we can do immediately. But on the other hand, we need to see this as an opportunity and sustained opportunity to build into the system. We are talking about transformative social behavior, transformative power relations. So if you want transformed power relations, we have to build in systems that are sustained over time and not, are done in a hurry and an ad hoc response. We need to move away from ad hoc responses of data collection also. So I think it's important. Data is important. We need to be innovative in collection also in these such circumstances, and that innovation comes through mobilizing and building capacity of the service providers. And we've seen so many examples now of people coming forward for relief. The government has given unconditional cash transfer to the poorest households, to millions in Pakistan. But the point is they've given relief, but no cognizance of the fact that how the women are being impacted, even in using and receiving the relief. So I think those are dimensions that we need to become more alert about, and dimensions that we need to build into all our processes that we adopt for responding to other needs. But those needs, gender-based violence is so intertwined with women's lives. So with that, I will say, I will re-emphasize the need for data, for immediate data, and for long-term data collection systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mumtaz. Your emphasis on the importance of quality services, not just on the number of cases, I think resonates as familiar across many countries, as many advocates are also calling for using case data to support and improve the very services that are collecting them. Thank you again. I am now pleased to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Jalen Paklarin. Ms. Paklarin, COVID-19 has created hardships as well as opportunities related to gender-based violence. What have organizations that address gender-based violence been experiencing, and what lessons have been learned related to the funding for women's rights and gender-based violence?
Prior to COVID-19, services on violence against women were already underfunded, and many of those services are life-saving assistance for women and families in crisis. And during COVID, it has become even hard to operate and meet the growing needs of women who face violence because most of these health institutions and services must also help to combat COVID-19. Eliminating violence against women is an important issue and advocacy. So in 2016, during a high-level discussion on the economic cost of violence against women, UN Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, Lakshmi Puri, said that the annual cost of intimate partner violence were calculated at $5.8 billion in the United States of America and $1.16 billion in Canada. Research indicates that the cost of violence against women could amount to around 2% of the global gross domestic product, and this is equivalent to 1.5 trillion, approximately the size of the economy of Canada. This only means that the cost of violence against women is expensive and has detrimental impact in the GDP of countries who fail to effectively address and allocate funds towards eliminating violence against women. Thus, it is appropriate and just to allocate sufficient funds for these kinds of services. Unfortunately, during lockdowns, women rarely try to access justice due to compounded problems. This included the challenges in looking for shelter, as mentioned earlier, transportation, including in India, and communication. Questions on who to contact when reporting any form of violence, whether to leave their children or not. Should they endure the violence, or is it safer to go out, are just few of the many issues that they face. So as representative of the Women's Legal and Human Rights Bureau, what did we learn from our experience during COVID-19? So some women do not even have money to call for help during the pandemic, as shared earlier. So provision of direct services for violence against women is life-changing during the pandemic. Flexibility of funding during emergencies, such as this pandemic, is very critical. Spaces for budget adjustments, such as providing communication allowance or giving community cell phones for the community women, helps in ensuring that referral of services to victims of violence is easier if there are readily available communication. So therefore, this kind of flexibility should be offered by funding agency and has been offered by the Safe and Fair project funded by the EU in the Philippines. Number 2, women are locked down with their perpetrator during the pandemic and cannot go out to cry for help. So the social media platforms has been very handy and effective. They are free and facilitated the communication between the victim and services needed. Although not all survivors are willing to seek justice or help, some women only want to get legal advice or just wanted to talk to someone with anonymity. These services were provided by the Women's Legal and Human Rights Bureau using online media platform even during lockdown. According to women we talked to, just knowing that there are organizations like WLB made them hope and believe that they can get out of that violent relationship when they are ready to seek for justice. In less than 3 months, WLB was able to help and assist more than 100 women and girls victims of violence during the pandemic. However, the use of this platform required WLB to hire additional legal staff and collaborate with social workers to handle the legal inquiries and requests from our FB page, which unfortunately is not included in our initial budgetary requirements. In addition, according to the UN Women Philippines, the Babaeng Biyahero platform, which provides information on women's rights and at the same time respond to violence against women cases, including their FB Live series, has reached 70 million women and women migrant workers all over the world. This only shows that technology-based platforms are good investments and can be used as a strategic platform to reach more women towards eliminating violence against women. Number 3, police and service providers are not present in far-flung areas, especially in rural areas. So funding the capability building of local women's organizations paid off during the pandemic. The presence of organized local community women's groups, as mentioned by earlier speakers, facilitated our work on the ground. If there are more organized women's groups on the ground, they can facilitate the easy access of referral pathways like psychosocial services, legal inquiries, and even provision of access to transportation in their own community. We need more funds to support capability building activities of women, especially in the rural areas. Therefore, capacity building strategy should be an important component of all project designs. And last but not the least, unfortunately, there are less women's organizations doing violence against women work now because of lack of funding to support their own work. Most of us are volunteers or doing voluntary work without staff support. So we appeal that we continue funding the work of the women's movement, especially from the Global South. Most especially local women's organizations, and ensure that funds are not restrictive and will support programmatic work and sustain the work of the institutions, especially organizations focused on violence against women. Indeed, the pandemic has exposed that there is a new normal. So business as usual approaches, responses, and funding will no longer work. Currently, the Philippines is suffering from a pandemic within a pandemic brought about by COVID-19 and Typhoon Bangko. As a feminist NGO, WLB believes that development aid and funding donors must continue to support civil society organizations and its partner communities during the crisis. There should be a space or leeway to amend the contract or adjust some of its activities to address the immediate concerns of women in the communities during the crisis. Targets and deliverables are important, but donors should also provide flexibility to respond to the practical needs of the communities in consultation with the partner NGO and its community partners, especially during this pandemic. After all, these aid or grants aim to empower women on the ground with or without a crisis. We ask you, together, let's continue to eliminate violence against women. Most importantly, continue to fund programs towards elimination of violence against women. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you so much, Ms. Paclaren, for raising the critical concerns about the availability of funding and resources and other issues facing women's rights organizations in our region on the ground. We see that women's organizations are not just delivering services, but also providing life-saving services that may not be available elsewhere. So thank you so much. We've heard from all of our four experts on the panel. Thank you again to all of you, not just for your continued work and efforts in combating gender-based violence, but also for sharing with us your very valuable insights with us this morning. Thank you. After this insightful listening session, let's now turn our attention to a distinguished panel of leaders to respond and share their vision on how we will end violence against women despite the challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me introduce and welcome Ms. Julianne Guevara, Australian Ambassador for Gender Equality, Mr. Bjorn Anderson, Regional Director, UNFPA Asia and the Pacific Regional Office, and Mr. Mohammed Nasseri, Regional Director, UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Having heard from frontline workers and civil society leaders on their experiences of gender-based violence and COVID-19, what areas are you acting on as priorities going forward related to the areas of fund, respond, prevent, collect, as outlined as the key areas for critical action? I would like to start with you, Ambassador Guevara, to share your reflections.
Well, thank you. And I would like to thank everyone who's obviously shared their insights and experiences with us today as we look at how we can work together to end all forms of violence against women and girls. It's a really important conversation that we're having today, and obviously important as we mark the International Day for the elimination of violence against women. I think we've all been really deeply concerned by reports of the increased gender-based violence since the outbreak of COVID-19, both globally but particularly in our region. I think as earlier speakers have recognised, there is a real risk that we will lose some of the progress that we've made towards gender equality, if we don't tackle this issue, the scourge of violence against women and girls. I think today we've obviously heard about the really important role and work that our civil society and women's rights organisations have played during COVID-19. They really have continued to be at the front line of responding to the escalation of gender-based violence. And certainly from our perspective here in Australia, we really do see them as partners as we work together to end violence against women and girls. And we really do need to continue to support these organisations in ensuring that essential services are being provided, continue to be provided to the survivors of violence at this time. I think obviously ending violence against women and girls is a priority for Australia, as it has been a part of our gender equality and women's empowerment strategy, which we've had in place since 2016. We have conducted an independent evaluation of Australia's efforts to end violence against women and girls, which we conducted in 2019, and it found that Australia has been a major contributor to global efforts to reduce violence against women, having delivered more than $300 million worth of support efforts to reduce and address gender-based violence between 2008 and 2018. And we really are committed to continuing these efforts. Australia is responding to the urgent needs, obviously, to address violence against women and girls during this COVID-19 crisis, both domestically and internationally. The Australian government has released Partnerships for Recovery, which is Australia's COVID-19 development response, and it places gender equality and women's empowerment centrally in Australia's foreign policy, our economic diplomacy, and our development responses. And included in that, of course, is this question of addressing gender-based violence as a priority. Certainly, we have welcomed this year's theme for the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, and its calls for, as you say, to fund, to respond, to prevent, and to collect. And we're working across 17 countries in the Indo-Pacific region, providing funding to support a package of efforts to directly respond and to help prevent violence against women and girls. And we're also working to support the collection of data and research to inform our programs and policies, which we've heard today, having that evidence base is so vitally important. We are and we will continue to ensure that funding is available for essential services to survivors of gender-based violence, including women's rights organisations. Australia is proud to have been a long-term supporter of the UN Trust Fund to end violence against women, and we have been a supporter since 2012. And really that's been to ensure that civil society and women's rights organisations receive funding and support to provide these essential services and to drive those really important prevention efforts that we've heard about today. Through our country programs, we continue to work with local organisations to ensure support and services are available. An example that I'll give you and share with you today is in Timor-Leste, where DFAT funds 65% of essential services, including shelters, legal aid, and counselling services for survivors of gender-based violence. Through the Access program, we're working with the Cambodian government agencies and multilateral organisations and civil society to ensure that services are available for women who are experiencing gender-based violence during this pandemic, including the provision of PPE, equipment and funding GBV hotlines, and also supporting staff to provide remote counselling services at this time. We'll continue to respond, ensuring essential services are prioritised and remain available and safe and accessible during and following the COVID-19 pandemic. Through the Pacific Partnerships to End Violence Against Women and Girls, Australia is working with the Pacific community, but also the European Union and UN Women to keep crisis centres operational during COVID-19. Through this partnership and other programs in the Pacific, Australia is supporting 8 crisis centres across the region and funding emergency accommodation, the provision of medical supplies, of food and sociological support for survivors of violence. And our support for the UN Joint Programme on Essential Services in the Indo-Pacific is helping to bolster, coordinate and improve multisectoral service delivery in line with international best practice. Of course, we'll continue our work to prevent gender-based violence before it occurs, to address gender inequalities at the root, which is, as we know, one of the causes of gender-based violence against women and girls. We're working with UN Women to deliver regional prevention activities and to build evidence on what works to prevent gender-based violence in the Indo-Pacific. Through our NABALAN program, Australia is working with the government of Timor-Leste and partner organisations to deliver primary prevention activities with youth and children, men and women, with a focus on adapting SASA, a community mobilisation program, to the Timor context, and we're providing technical advice to Pacific governments on family protection and approaches to ending violence. As some of the other speakers have alluded to today, clearly we lack data on violence prevalence and the impact and burden of violence against women and girls at times remain hidden. This is one of the reasons why we are a core funder and supporter of the first phase of UNFP's NOVOR data program. The idea of that is to strengthen, obviously, regional and national capacities to measure violence against women and to inform the development of policies and programs. And through our country programs, we're also continuing to support research and data collection to ensure our support is always evidence-based. As we work to build back better, obviously, following this pandemic, we will continue with our work to end violence against women and girls in the Pacific through a really comprehensive response. We want to build on our ongoing commitment to fund essential services, to respond to the crisis, and to continue our long-term evidence-based prevention efforts, and to ensure that we contribute and collect the data to inform our ongoing policy and program efforts. I think that just gives you a bit of a sense that we really do want to take a very, as I said, holistic approach to, these very serious issues at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Guevara, for laying out this vision and giving us a bigger look about all the efforts that are being undertaken to combat the issue of gender-based violence in the region. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Anderson to offer some insights based on UNFPA's work across this region.
Our conversation today really shows how important it is that we all work together to fight and end harmful practices and gender-based violence to women. And I think what previous speakers have said or highlighted is that in order to be able to end domestic violence, end rape, and end harmful practices like female genital mutilation, we really need to work together and make sure we are not working in vacuum or in isolation to one another. And that is so important, especially if we are going to be able to address the root causes that manifest the gender-based violence, such as gender inequality, patriarchy, and harmful gender and social norms. And funding in this regard is absolutely key. And funds coming in on a sustainable basis, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic, really is key to be able to reach out to support frontline workers, to be able to change all of these harmful norms and values which exist in all societies. In terms of preventing, which is really work that we are doing within UNFPA, we need to continue the ways to engage and empower people, individuals in societies, to be able for them to change what I was just mentioning about power structures and how we change norms and values. It has to come from within societies in order to be able to be long-standing, whether we are working in a long-term development context or in a humanitarian situation. And in that regard, working with teachers to encourage and promote comprehensive sexuality education to young people, both men and both boys and girls, absolutely essential. It has to start, at an age where we understand that we need to respect one another in terms of our own ways of seeing our own bodies and how we are working as individuals. But of course, it is very much also important to reach out to faith-based organizations, faith leaders, health officials, government leaders, community leaders, in order to be able to have an impact on the norms and values which are actually contributing to or fuel the gender-based violence. But of course, on the other side, which has also been discussed earlier this morning, it's very much on how we do responses and how we make sure that we can effectively, governments can effectively investigate and prosecute and punish men who commit these crimes. That is essential in order to be able to see that reporting and working to address these matters really has a meaning in societies. And finally, which is so important, and I'm really glad that Madam Ambassador, you mentioned the UNFPA's NOAO data, which is really a flagship for UNFPA in the region to collect data in different situations and also to provide learning opportunities and strengthening capacity at the country level. Because without solid evidence, we will never be able to effectively have an impact on governments and decision makers. So this is really an important work that we have done together with the Australian government. Now, all of this, like I said in the beginning, it cannot take place in a vacuum. It is 4 different pillars that is so critical to fund innovations, new ways of working in different contexts, but also making sure that we fund what works, to prevent, to work with people, to change societies on how they see gender-based violence and appreciate that there must be the same value whether it's a men or women, and also to respond effectively and to collect information and evidence. And that's the only way we can make sure that we are continuing to stand up to say that it's enough to violence, and not just one day, but all these 365 days a year. And we also must prevent violence, and until we have ended, we must provide everything women and girls need to survive and recover, from physical and mental health care to legal aid and support for gaining livelihoods. Without that, there will be no dignities in our societies. Thank you, Cindy.
Mr. Nasseri, over to you now to share your perspectives based on UN's work across the region.
Thank you, Cindy, and I go by Muhammad as usual. I'm really appreciative of today's roundtable and the compelling remarks by Aparna, Emma, Jelen, and Kawar, who really illustrated exactly the key issues that many of us are wrestling with at the moment. Those issues are to ensure services remain open, accessible, and of good quality through all means, including through technology, that we are being creative and use this moment to push forward with the transformative social norms change to bring about gender equality, that we collect only necessary data now, ethically, and lean into existing data on violence against women, and critically, that we work together to move more resources into the hands of women's organizations who tirelessly are working to end violence against women and girls. Their interventions also showed us, Cindy, that we as UN Women are on the right track. And with that, it will be a good segue to move into the 4 pillars that you've asked about, starting with the funding. Despite the interruptions that imposed by the outbreak of COVID, we have not paused our response to violence, and the pressing issue of ensuring that urgent and flexible funding to women's rights organizations, often frontline first responders, health, crisis, support services, and helplines remain secure. We are paying attention to supporting women at scale by working with governments, development banks, and civil society organizations who are continuing to pressure states to invest in universal gender-responsive social protection. UN Women is also supporting the design of fiscal stimulus packages that are targeted at women, offering support for existing civil society organizations, providing more funding to help them adjust to challenges arising as a result of COVID. We're also urging governments to put funding in the hands of women who need it most. There is evidence that giving cash to poor households, when designed to reduce the risk of domestic violence as well as to relieve poverty, can result in lower rates of such violence. We have been developing and sharing guidance for governments, humanitarian and development actors to ensure that their COVID response is gender responsive and ending violence against women is integrated. In the area of prevention, through campaigns working with schools and universities, partnering with CSOs, media, influencers, and the private sector, our focus is shifting social norms in the direction of total rejection of violence against women and girls. This pandemic has reminded us that national strategies are needed to drive the most impactful approaches to prevent violence. UN Women is the technical partner with the Fiji government to develop a national action plan on prevention, the second in the world after Australia. This plan is evidence-based and designed to be whole of government and whole of community, pulling in expertise from across sectors. We see the growing trend of misogyny and harassment in the digital sphere. Our analysis of social media suggests that COVID lockdowns push more people online. Digital platforms and online spaces are being increasingly used to spread sexist, inaccurate, and dangerous rhetoric about women, inciting hatred and provoking violence online and offline. This is why we're working with governments, civil society, and researchers in the region to better identify and block hateful content and build social media literacy, including counter disinformation. We recognize the need to expand legislation that criminalizes cyber harassment and stalking. Our efforts include messaging content designed for men about gender equality. We've enlisted the participation and support of entertainers and influencers, including you, Cindy, UN Women's Regional Goodwill Ambassador, to create content to nudge us in the right direction of gender equality, including the launch of the He for She at Home campaign that you've referred to, Cindy, earlier. In the area of response, we fully agree that messages from experts today that we must treat services for women who experienced violence as essential anytime and especially during emergencies. UN Women is constantly working to strengthen systems to build back to better, improving access for survivors to services and helping to shape them to respond through technology or through remote support options. We also work with police and judiciary to provide training for them to how to respond, protect, and refer victims and survivors to appropriate services. This includes shifting services online and expanding the scope of services through text, chat, and other technologies. In Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, and many other countries, we're cooperating with civil society groups to share information through radio programs, podcasts, and social media groups on violence against women. And finally, Cindy, in the area of data collection, We do note that global lockdowns forced people to remain at home and in some cases with abusive partners. UN Women and UNFPA have joined forces to analyze big data online sources about violence against women during COVID. Across all countries studied in Asia, reported domestic violence cases have increased. In India, cases rose by 21%. In Singapore, there was a 33% increase in calls to domestic violence helplines, while in Nepal it was more than 50%. Searches related to physical violence in Malaysia, Philippines, and Nepal grew by 47%, 63%, and 55% respectively. During lockdowns, internet usage grew in all countries. Studied online platforms saw more online misogyny, such as trolling, using images without consent, or sexual harassment. We observed users using Twitter, for example, to blame victims in cases of sexual violence, and misogynistic comments under girls' posts or articles about violence appeared more frequently. However, the silver lining is online support for victims and survivors through social media group posts and campaigns by service providers also increased. A major part of UN Women's work is to deliver gender analysis and sex disaggregated data to inform national policies. While gendered violence is a humanitarian crisis that must be addressed urgently, there is still the need for more sex disaggregated data and research, a key step in identifying those most at risk and directing support to them. Thank you, Cindy, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nasseri. I would like to invite you to please stay with us, as well as Mr. Anderson and Ambassador Guevara, for some closing remarks. We are pleased to now hear from Ms. Fabienne van den Eede, Deputy Head of Unit, Human Rights, Democracy, Gender Equality of the European Commission, to reflect on the significant investments the European Union has made in ending violence against women across the region and globally.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here with you in this regional event to mark the 16 days of activism. 2020 is a year without precedents. But even before 2020, violence against women and girls was a global problem of staggering proportions. And this crisis has only made it worse. Yet again, we also see that women and girls are disproportionately hard hit. This is alarming. We all need to work harder to stop this. The EU is a global frontrunner when it comes to women's rights, women empowerment, and gender equality. At the end of 2017, we decided to join forces with the United Nations, and we launched the Spotlight Initiative, the biggest ever global effort to combat and prevent violence against women and girls, with an unprecedented investment of 500 million euros. Today, I'm very proud to say that the initiative is up and running in 26 countries and 6 different regions. For this particular region, we have 7 ongoing country programs, and we have 3 regional programs, 2 in Asia and 1 in the Pacific. Spotlight is multi-sectoral. It has a comprehensive approach. It's survivor-centered, evidence-based, and it has a special eye for the most vulnerable, marginalized populations. Together with the countries and with civil society and with many other partners, we work to have better laws, to have stronger institutions, to increase prevention and awareness, to get better support services to victims, collect data, and support the women's movement. All of this very much in tune with the fund, prevent, respond, and collect principles of the UN strategic engagement. Since March 2020, we have been working hard in the Spotlight Initiative to respond to this crisis. Now this initiative seems more relevant than ever. Prevention has been boosted, support services have been increased, and we've also provided the much-needed lifelines to women's organizations, not only for them to be able to survive, but also to continue to work in the best possible and safest conditions. We also see that very innovative approaches were used, all sorts of digital platforms, mobile clinics, remote legal representation, and the repurposing of safe spaces, just to name a few. I would like now to share with you a few examples of activities, actions which have been taken place in these particular regions in the last months. The Spotlight Initiative has contributed to the strengthening of legislative frameworks in India and in Kyrgyzstan to increase protection for victims and migrant workers. In Kyrgyzstan, work is also currently being done towards a law on state-guaranteed legal aid. In PNG, teams are working hard at national and provincial level to get essentially budgetary allocations toward the specialized family support services, and work is also done with the National Department of Education to include prevention and response to violence into school curricula. Partnerships have been concluded with several civil society organizations to strengthen referral systems, to implement male advocacy campaigns, to provide integrated health services and case management services. In Timor-Leste, nearly 300,000 people were reached through a campaign that highlighted the devastating impact of intimate partner violence, and a code of conduct was also established for the quarantine facilities. In Tajikistan, a social media campaign was launched during the crisis on positive parenting, with a special attention on girls, their education, and their mental well-being. The Ministry of Health in Tajikistan also decided to have additional victim support rooms, which are short-term shelters. As EU, we believe very strongly in a world free from violence, and this is also why we decided the Action Coalition on Violence as a co-lead in the Gender Equality Forum. Looking forward, we will continue to work very hard to implement the Spotlight Initiative, which we believe should become the reference, should become a global platform, should become a model of investment, and we really hope that others will join. At European Union level, soon our new financial framework will be adopted, and once more we see that the gender equality, women empowerment will be at the core of our work. And of course, we will continue to work on a world free from violence, both inside and outside our borders. I'm also very proud to say that next week we will launch our new Gender Action Plan, which will enable us to fulfill our commitments, the Agenda 2030, and to accelerate efforts. We want to lead as European Union, and we would like others to join. So I would say, let's orange this world together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. van den Eede, for your contribution. This year's Unite campaign to end violence against women calls for clear and concrete actions from senior leaders. We invite our final commitments from our regional leaders. So please, could you tell us, what is the main commitment that you are making to end gender-based violence in the context of COVID, and what do you encourage other leaders to commit to? We'll start with you, Ambassador Guevara.
Thanks very much, Cindy. I mean, obviously, we know that violence against women and girls is unacceptable at any time, but of course, it's particularly unacceptable during this COVID-19 crisis. The importance of addressing violence against women and girls as part of our emergency and recovery response to COVID-19 cannot be underestimated. The failure to respond, I think, could see very significant backsliding in our gender equality gains, which can have longer term impacts both on development and recovery. Australia is committed to continuing our efforts in the Indo-Pacific to end violence against women and girls, both as part of our COVID-19 response, but also as we work to build back better in our region. For our part, we will continue to fund services and frontline responders to support response efforts, as we've heard today, including from some of our civil society and women's rights organisations. We want to continue to focus on the prevention to stop violence before it even starts. And as our colleague from UNFPA said, to collect that data that we need to build an evidence base that works so that we can end violence against women and girls. I certainly would encourage others to join us in these efforts, and we really do look forward to working with partners in the region, whether that be multilateral organisations such as UN Women or civil society groups and women's rights organisations, but we really are committed to ending violence against women and girls in our region. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your strong support, and I wish you all the best. I would now like to invite Mr. Anderson. Going forward, what is the key priority and commitment for UNFPA to address GBV in the region?
Thank you so much, Cindy, for this, and also for hosting this conversation. I think the COVID-19 pandemic in particular has shown that responding to gender-based violence in the context of a very unprecedented challenge requires creativity, collaboration, and courage. And this has been, as displayed over and over again from all our humanitarian heroes and frontline GBV responders, supporting survivors in so many different ways in country after country. And UNFPA in Asia and the Pacific, we will work tirelessly to this end, to leveraging our technical support and leadership and our strong relationships with governments and other partners, both during the pandemic, but also as we build this region back better post-COVID-19 pandemic. So we will continue our funding opportunities. We will seek different ways of raising support, political support, financial support, in order to be able to finally end gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Anderson. And for our last speaker, Mr. Nasseri, please share the main commitments for UN Women.
Thank you, Cindy. In concrete terms, UN Women commits to accelerating action to drive essential services for survivors of violence against women alongside government and civil society across sectors, with an emphasis on policing and a view to updating systems and policies to be flexible during emergencies such as this pandemic. We commit to bring cutting-edge evidence into practice to prevent violence against women as countries seek ways to build more equitable, prosperous, and secure societies, more resilient to shocks such as COVID, freeing up women from violence and fear to move squarely into productive leadership and innovating roles. Thank you again, Cindy.
Thank you, Mr. Nasseri, and thank all of you as well. Our deepest gratitudes for all of our regional leaders who have taken the time to be with us and to outline the prevailing challenges as well as the opportunities we have on this issue. It's clear that success in ending violence against women is based on the fact that we can get out of our comfort zones and perhaps sometimes connect issues that are not always seen as together, such as economic stability, security, and violence against women. And especially during COVID-19, it is insisted that we look for further ways on how we can create safer, healthier, more stable families and societies. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
At the start of today's event, we shared the call from the UN Secretary General to widen the circle of leaders, influencers, and people from all walks of life, not only to raise our voices, but to build individual and collective action to end violence against women. Let's take a moment to witness personal commitments for collective action.
COVID-19 is a pandemic the world is not prepared for. When we talk about persons with disabilities, they face a lot of discrimination. 50% of them are women and girls with disabilities who are facing every day in their lives the gender-based violence, sexual harassment, and they are not getting the access to the sexual health and reproductive rights. We are witnessing thousands of women with disabilities are dying every day just because of unavailability of the resources and the services. We cannot wait for another decade to see the change. We have to work today. We have to join hands today to work with influence the state representative, UN, international organizations. And we have to show the solidarity among the movements to work for the rights of women and girls with disability. I commit myself to do work for the rights of women and girls with disability through empowering them, to giving them the voice and the platform. And we need to encourage them to work for their rights.
The COVID-19 pandemic has turned our life upside down, but it has also taught us a new way of living with social unity and resilience. During the lockdown, many women's shelters in Nepal were unable to provide the needed services to respond to the escalating violence against women, particularly domestic violence. I helped in conducting dialogues and in developing a national shelter management protocol. And I commit to continue to advocate for shelter support as essential services that will remain open to those who seek service at all times. As a CEDAW committee member, I led the development of a CEDAW guidance note on COVID-19, and I commit to strengthen accountability of member states, urging them to include prevention and redress of women and girls as a key part of the national response programs. Engaging with the youth is, I think, critical. I have organized several youth webinars on generation equality, and I commit to continue learning, sharing, and uniting with the youth as key agents to end violence against women.
I'm Helen Clark, and I'm joining the call for action issued by the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health, calling on governments to step up prevention programs to tackle the violence which is occurring against women, children and adolescents. In the context of COVID-19 and the lockdowns, we have seen women and children at vastly greater risk of domestic violence. This is a blight and a scourge on all our societies, and it has to stop. We need funding, we need investment into programs proven to work to stop this violence. I call on everyone to unite around this call and stop violence against women for once and for all.
This pandemic has been very difficult for all of us, but for some even more. We thought it was a privilege to be under a roof, to be safe, but stay home, stay safe. The irony of that for many women and children cannot be ignored. Domestic violence has been on a rise ever since the lockdown. Many women are locked up with their perpetrators. In fact, many are even calling it the shadow pandemic. I made a 7-minute short film called Listen to Her, more as a spontaneous response to what is happening around us. One does feel very helpless that we are not able to do much. So I think the least we can do is to commit ourselves, and I commit myself, that when we see any form of violence around us, people that we know, even if we get any sense of it, that we will do something about it. We will not ignore it. We will not let it slide. We will not tell the person to try one more time and tolerate it. So I think let's all commit to breaking this silence around domestic violence, which is considered a private matter, but it isn't. It is a human rights issue. It concerns all of us. So let's all begin by breaking that silence together.
I'm making a personal commitment to ensure that our schools are not breeding ground for perpetrators, that we have a zero tolerance policy for any and all forms of victim blaming within our school communities, and that we incorporate comprehensive sexuality education into our curriculum, where we teach young girls and femmes that they have a right to loudly and boldly say no, and for young boys to know that they are not entitled to other people's bodies, and that no means no.
In our culture, when domestic violence happen, people will believe that is like family issue, family matter, so the outsider should not get involved. When you hear or see someone being violent to someone you know or some stranger, don't be bystander. You don't have to be a social worker like me. You don't have to be an activist. You don't have to be the CEO, or you don't have to be police. You just be you. You can be a friend, you can be a sister, you can be a mother, and just do something. I think it is possible for us to have a world without violence, but I think it starts with our voice and action.
This brings us to the close of our event. On behalf of the United Nations family here in Asia and the Pacific, thank you to all of today's eminent speakers for your insightful and heartfelt contributions. Today's dialogue recognizes the urgency of questioning any acceptance of violence and also testing new ways to create gender equal societies in our workplaces, in our schools, in our public spaces, in decision-making bodies, in the media, and everywhere. Thank you also for your time and individual efforts in ending violence against women and girls. It is clear this will take all of us. And to our audience watching across Asia Pacific and beyond, if you've been inspired by today's event, we encourage you to share the recording once posted online with others via social media. Do leave a comment and tell us what you thought, and share your commitments with us as well.